Not everyone would call us professionals, but that's what we wrote down. So, cool. Well, thank you all for coming out. Appreciate it. This is a pretty good turnout for a cloud security talk at a AppSec conference. I appreciate that. So yeah, diving into this. This is cloud security at scale. So, what are we talking about? So Ken and I have had similar careers, but we've also done some different things. We both started out in application security. We moved into both Blue Team and doing more consulting, and then we've gotten more into cloud security the past few years. So we talk about kind of our experiences, war stories, all those things, and we talked about some of the things that we'd seen at different financial companies that we'd worked either with or in, and we realized there was a lot of similarities, and we should put a talk together about that and kind of share our experiences, our wins, our losses, all those kinds of things. That's what started this talk. Oops. So, as I said, I'm a AppSec and cloud security consultant. So, I spend most of my time working with clients and trying to help them solve their issues. I've done AppSec for a long time, but now moved more into cloud security the past few years. I've worked with small startup companies with very small cloud footprint, and also some pretty large financials that are pushing the edges of what you can do in AWS. So I've seen kind of both sides of things.
And then on my side of the fence, I started out in consulting and then went sort of staff security for a long time and doing the Blue Team thing. And this is sort of what my life looked like for a really long time. I spent, I took some of that consulting experience, ran a security program. And so while Mike was saying, our experiences have differed, we've run into a lot of the same challenges, handled them a little bit differently, and had a different perspective on each of them. So hopefully we can take you through some of those.
Yeah, so we already covered that. So we structured the talk in kind of three pieces. So as I talked about, we worked with different financials over time. So we took 3 examples of companies we worked with, and they're not all, this isn't necessarily all real companies, but it's experiences from different places. So we set up a few different stories, and yes, these are Simpsons references if you don't get that.
The stories are real. The names have been changed to, but yeah, we're bringing our experience and trying to see what this looks like in the real world.
Yeah, and what's interesting is all 3 are in different places in their cloud journey. They're also slightly different companies, but they're all financials, so they all deal with a lot of the same issues, but at different scales and they're at different places in the process. So some of the themes that we saw across all these companies was complexity. That might seem pretty straightforward, but complexity, we had that issue on-prem, and now we're moving to the cloud where everything moves much faster. And so complexity happens very quickly when you're trying to move into the cloud. And so that was true in small companies and large companies, but it was much worse in large companies. All 3 had a foot in both worlds, as in they had on-prem infrastructure. They were not, they weren't born in the cloud, so they had on-prem infrastructure. They're still maintaining. A lot of their business ran off on-prem infrastructure, and they're trying to adapt security to the cloud. Most of them had a pretty mature on-prem security presence, but now they have to adapt that to the cloud. So to start things off, Bart's Banking. So this was a company or is a company, they didn't go under or anything, that they had been in the cloud for 5+ years, which in cloud terms is a very long time. They started before AWS was anything like it is now. And they have a very large infrastructure. So, hundreds to thousands of applications, hundreds of AWS accounts, tons and tons of workloads. And so they're kind of the bleeding edge of doing cloud or in a financial. And so thinking about what cloud maturity looks like for pretty much any company, I kind of think of it as a few different things. So everyone is probably familiar with the OODA loop, but it's the whole idea of being able to get your bearings and then making decisions and then acting on those decisions. So a lot of companies struggle with even the basics with these kinds of things. So if you have thousands of apps, hundreds of accounts, are you even able to know what's out there? Are you able to observe what's going on? Then can you, orient and figure out who owns what, how to fix something, and then actually act and do it? So this is an example of a company who over many years was able to do that. That was kind of the maturity that they built over time. Through a lot of hard work, it wasn't anything simple. But that was kind of a sign of maturity that I saw, was that even though this is relatively basic, this isn't machine learning security, this isn't AI fixing security, this is a level of maturity that we didn't see everywhere else. But that's because they had years of experience doing this. So getting to complexity. So in the beginning, they had a pretty simple set of workloads in the cloud. What we all know is kind of the 3-tier web applications. Nothing too crazy, using a few different AWS services. They were using things back in the day before even some of the services that most people use now were around. So it was relatively simple, but that grew over time. So in the middle, more and more moved to the cloud, more apps, more accounts, more users. Things got more complex. So using more and more services, and you can see the interconnectivity. And then where things are today, not to say it's a total train wreck, but if you looked at it, you wouldn't necessarily know, what's going on. It's hard to reason about what the infrastructure looks like. And so this is, the chief architect of the cloud. And the thing I like to say is, at every big company, there's probably 1 or 2 people in a basement somewhere who actually know how everything works. Everyone else just has to go to them and ask questions. And they look like him because they're driven crazy by how, complex everything is. So yeah, complexity is my word of the day, because it makes operations more difficult. It makes deployment more difficult, but it especially makes security more difficult, because if you don't know how things work, if you don't know how 2 networks are talking, if you don't know what access someone has, how do you work through and secure those things? So that's a huge issue when you get into the cloud, because it's easy, you can spin up a new account in 15 minutes and have that talking to your production, VPCs in 20 minutes. So how do you do authentication and authorization at scale when you're doing so much in the cloud? Another issue is on-prem to cloud access. This company, Bart's Banking, they were cloud-centric, so everything was being built in the cloud, but they still had on-prem they had to deal with. They weren't going to move Oracle servers from on-prem into the cloud, so that stuff still existed there. And so they still had to work with the restrictions and issues with on-prem infrastructure talking to the cloud. And that leads to an issue of data ingress. How do you track all the places that data comes from? Because that's where, especially if you work in finances, you're going to have PII, you might have credit card numbers, you might have social security numbers, GDPR, all those kinds of things. How do you track where those things come from? And so I think something that people who haven't worked a lot in the cloud, especially at big companies, don't really realize is there are service limits on everything on AWS. And so on the bottom left, you'll see those are the service limits on IAM for the cloud. And you would think, who would ever need more than 1,500 policies for IAM in the cloud? But I know customers who have asked AWS to raise all of these and are still hitting them. And that's what happens over time is people don't go into the cloud with a lot of structure or planning, and things just sprawl like crazy. So meanwhile, security, I'm a security person, so I don't mean to be insulting, but I don't feel like we knocked on-prem security out of the park before we started moving on to the cloud. So we're now struggling to still I'll just keep letting this play. We struggled to do on-prem security well, and now we're doing cloud security as well, and then we have to interconnect those 2 pieces. It's very difficult. So a good security team is trying to enable without being insecure, which is very difficult in the cloud, because at every reInvent, AWS announces some new service which sounds awesome to the developer, and now it's up to the security team to figure out how to make that available and secure that so that it's not just another, insecure service out there. And you also have to build security services that are cloud-centric. You can't just have everyone funneling back to on-prem for some kind of service for like KMS or something like that. You have to have cloud-centric solutions. At the same time, our job is a huge amount of putting out fires and plugging holes, and that's, now the holes are cloud scale instead of just on-prem, and now people have access to great security groups with port 22 open to the world versus, changing firewall rules, which was done by a small team generally. So, what are some of the things that, I dealt with while we were there, while my company was there? So, a few different things. So, controlling data ingress, that was a big one. Kind of going back to the beginning, it's not about some crazy, super technical way of solving these issues. It's fundamentals a lot of times. So understanding where your data is coming from, understanding the sources of it, and really locking that down and creating pipelines and patterns for how you get that data into your accounts. And that goes to file transfer too, is the same thing. Building standardized ways of doing this really helps, and then publishing it and making it available for everyone to use. And then tackling PCI. It's like people's least favorite thing to deal with, but a lot of people, especially in financials, have to be PCI compliant. And there actually are some good opportunities in the cloud to tackle that, because you can do things like microsegmentation very easily, because everything is ephemeral, everything is virtual. So a new account costs you nothing. Setting up dedicated networking and routes for PCI is very straightforward. So, and I sort of touched on this, but a word on data scientists. Are there any data scientists in the room? Two people were brave enough to say yes. So let me say, I have a lot of respect for data scientists. They do amazing things. I'm not going to say that I understand everything about machine learning or can do all those things. But from a security perspective, I'm sorry. I don't mean to hate on anyone, but my experience was, you have this huge formal security team who's trying to secure the data in the cloud, secure your infrastructure, do all these things, and then you have a data science team who's like, all right, I'm going to spin up an AWS account. I'm going to pipe all of our PII data over there so I can run some Python scripts, because doing everything through the official process is way too hard. So apologies, but it's my experience. So Michael Jordan, visionary. He was way ahead of the curve in basketball, but he also knew quite a bit about cloud security. So yeah, part of that quote is cut off. It was about cloud. So what are the keys to basketball, and what are the keys to cloud security? It is about the fundamentals. That's true about every piece of security. It doesn't matter if it's network or application or cloud security. But I think the basics are what people miss, because they're focused on more interesting and cutting edge type of solutions. But it's really, if you can inventory what you have in the cloud, if you can detect the drift that's going on based on your baseline, alert on that, and then remediate it quickly, you're way ahead of the curve compared to most places. And I think the cloud allows people to do things very quickly and at huge scale. And that's a problem in the sense of trying to keep the pace up with what people are doing so quickly. But it also gives us, as security people, the ability to scale our solutions very quickly too, and react very quickly. So I think it's a huge opportunity for us.
Yeah, so thanks. So I think to summarize, what Mike has been saying is, regulated financial services can really be a cloud hell for a variety of reasons. And if you're pouring gasoline on a fire, then it can look just like that. It's challenging. You're handcuffed by things like compliance and regulation and an aversion to change. And, in finance, money matters. It's people's livelihoods. There's a lot of liability and lawyers involved. There's a big misunderstanding of cloud in general and how to move correctly, and it's changing all the time. So my perspective is really from being inside of one of those organizations for an extended period of time and sort of shedding some light on that and how we handled it. So this name to protect the innocent is Lisa's Lending. And I want to talk about this one for a little bit because it's more of a medium-sized organization. They are doing a lot of innovative things in finance. They're hungry for new stuff. They have a lot of really great talent. Managers are technical, but they're just starting to get bound by things like regulations and partnerships and larger organizations that are sort of bringing this stuff down into their world. And it handcuffs people in some regards. So you have to adapt to that and be flexible with that. So I don't want it to come across that, folks are not considering security and that they're, compliance secure or anything like that. We want to shed some light on like how we sort of do some skunkwork security to try to make real stuff happen. So as Mike mentioned, I want to get into some of the major things that we faced being internal to that. The major one is not moving. So we'll wait for that. I'll start talking to it if it gets to it, but some of the major things are they're large and they're complex. Now, size and complexity isn't just necessarily an organizational thing. They can be large banks or large financial institutions, but it's also the complexity of the organization itself when it's establishing a relationship with those types of organizations, whether those are partnerships or your applications are complicated or something along those lines. The people you work with are important as much as PCI or some other SOX or SOC or something like that. So they are heavily regulated. They are heavily regulated. All right, so we're having some technical difficulties and the slides aren't moving. But when regulations hit, we always preach in security that compliance doesn't equal security. But then the question becomes, how do you do it right? You're going to have to meet that compliance ask. And the importance is making that regulation work for you in as much of a way as possible. The other thing is that your partnerships and the people that you work with may have regulations that you don't feel like you need to adhere to, but in order to engage in that partnership, you're going to have to work with that. And Lisa's lending, that was FIPS 140-2 level 3. Is anybody familiar with that? Yeah, it's a pain in the ass. It's a lot of physical security requirements and encryption requirements that you really don't necessarily want to deal with. And in some cases, the management of that type of thing in a smaller organization is so complex that you end up being less secure because you're trying to meet all these requirements that you don't have the expertise for. So how do you approach that? In regulation, there's also this misconception of what the cloud offers you. How many folks have gone into a vendor meeting or something like that, and somebody says, AWS is SOC 2 compliant and PCI compliant, so we're good to go, right? It's all about the implementation of that. And so if you have that, if you go in with that mindset, you're basically having to change people's minds as you go. So now you're talking about how these vendors are trying to you're trying to get these vendors are trying to sell to your business. So they're saying all these things to higher level management and they may not be technical. So you're trying to get all this stuff going in together. Can you go to the next slide on there at least? Yeah. So when you're going from the data center to the cloud, you have this idea that, okay, we're going to take our data center, we're going to move it to the cloud. Everyone's like, no, don't lift and shift. You want to use what's available to you and all of that. But there's so many things that you have to consider with that. The cloud to us isn't just AWS, right? It's SaaS providers. It's your CRM, your integrations, in financial institutions, you have these weird niche sort of financial institution providers that are these COTS off the shelf. They only do like ACH or transactional things. So when you are trying to think about, well, what is the cloud going to offer me? Many folks will come to you with AWS services, but that's not really all that you're having to think about. So this is where I was at. This is exactly where I was at. Okay. So we have these third parties, and then we're thinking about how do we convert to the cloud? Some people will go with lift and shift, and that might be the best option for them. How many of you have seen this? Okay. That is like my hell for like 2 years, because when you look at this, and this is sold to you, and this is sold to management, they're like, well, let's just use SaaS. We don't have to do anything in security. Or let's just do infrastructure as a service. But there are so many things that you have to consider with it. When you're doing virtualization and servers and storage and networking, yeah, your vendor manages it, but you still have configuration options with something like EBS. You've got VPCs to worry about. You may not control the hypervisor or the low-level hardware, but you still have responsibility there. And in some cases, especially in application security, those are now going from your operations folks to your development teams. So now your development teams have to be experts in this new configuration item. So they have to be familiar with whatever cloud provider you're going through. And then to Mike's point about multi-cloud, you add more clouds to that, and then you end up putting all of that back onto one team. So when you're looking at this, you really have to consider the layers of security that go along with each of these areas. Also legacy stuff. Oh my God. So you have, when you start as a sort of this medium, we're innovative, we're using things, back in the day, it was like, we're using Ruby, and we're in finance. And so you get into starting these partnerships and you're like, okay, now we got to integrate with like COBOL and mainframes. So, you're trying to tie these two things together and move to the cloud all at the same time and maintain the security of it. And as Mike said, with that wonderful animation of security and how we feel, we're trying to basically do all these things at one time with like a 7-person team. So basically the point is we're all taking a leap of faith together. If you convince your organization to go to the cloud and you're hiring people like Mike and you're bringing them along with you, like they're putting their trust in you to take this leap of faith, not only your organization, but the partners that you're working with and everyone else. But everyone's still like really freaking confused about everything, and they don't know what services to use, what processes they need to change, what they can and can't do. And that's just on how do we get there, not even focusing on the security. So for leases lending, we tried to focus on some key areas other than regulation, which is going to sort of permeate all of this. The first was stability. Like, how do we keep our clients on the platform? How do we make sure that we're not, introducing some sort of latency or whatever, the stability of the team, what expertise we need, whether the product is going to be more or less efficient. Like, those are concerns of management in the business because, we don't have as much of that absorption cost. And then resource management. Like I mentioned, we're a really small security team. We're like 1 to 75 developers or something like that. We had like one AppSec person. And when you're scaling like that, you have that person doing assessments or whatever it may be. And then you're like, okay, now go learn the cloud and then come back and you're going to do all that too. And so you're trying to figure out, how are you going to make that work? Are you hiring consultants? Are you just putting in a small workload? What do you do? And then on the more functional side, there were a couple of services, key management and secret management, that sort of permeated everything that we did that we had to figure out. Back to the FIPS 140-2 level 3, real pain in the butt when you're going to cloud. Now, when you're looking at that means that you have these client requirements, these regulatory requirements, and then you're trying to figure it all out and make sure that it is actually secure. And then with secret management, it was one of those things where, when you're young and you're an organization and all of your developers are creating like password 1 passwords for staging, and they're like, it's just staging or it's just development. You're like, okay, well, now we have an opportunity to like change that paradigm and move to the cloud and use something that we can dynamically generate. But wait, we still have stuff in the data center. So how the hell are we going to do that? So this is where we sort of gotten into the solutioning. And the first like step we took into it, the consultants we talked to, we weren't talking to Mike. He wouldn't recommend this, but they were like, well, AWS has Cloud HSM, just use that. They've got KMS, just use that. They have IAM, just use that. And we're like, but we still have things in the data center that aren't going to move, at least in the next year or 2 years, that we have to think about. So how are we going to leverage these AWS services? So it really came down to a business decision across the board where security basically had to sell security as we do as an equation of time, money, and effort. And security is traditionally a cost center. So how do we become a functional benefit to the business? And we tried to tie everything back to this. If we look at IAM or account management, we want better, easier account management. If we want to talk about secret management, it's because we're making those secrets, not only we're making them more secure, but they auto rotate. Your developers don't have to worry about them. They just request the access. We handle that through access control. We get to reduce the overall access of those developers. So we're making it more secure and faster for the business. We're reducing the amount of time that developers spend on that. If you talk about things like buying authentication with something like Cognito or Auth0, which is really hard in financial services, by the way. Identity is a big deal. you're saying, we're buying a whole team of people. These people specialize in authentication. We have one person to work on it here. Would you rather, John in the basement pouring gasoline on the fire work on the authentication, or do you want an entire team that's dedicated their entire business to this? So you're trying to sell, like, how are you going to reduce the time, reduce the money spent, or reduce the effort that you put into it? And then you're going to meet all your compliance concerns along the way. So this is what that journey for Lisa's Lending looked like, right? We started out as we have some things in the data center, we have some things in the offices, we have some HSMs over there that are highly available. It's all integrated with LDAP. Now, as we take that step into the cloud, we have to consider how we're going to maintain this double life. And so we start experimenting with containerization like Docker. And then for secrets management, we start experimenting with Vault, because the major decision there was, how do we use something that's going to support both infrastructures? We still have to maintain that FIPS 140-2 level 3, so we have that. And we still have these servers down in the office that the data scientists are using. So how are we going to move this over? We have IAM up there, we're integrating with LDAP, we're experimenting, and then the idea past this dotted line, which that's still in migration, is sort of like, okay, we're going to start leveraging organizations, maybe we'll experiment with Kubernetes, and we'll try Cloud HSM with the idea that maybe they're going to come along and fulfill that, and then we can start reducing some of the lower infrastructure, reducing the money spent on these on-premise functions like HSM. And then, the dream is basically we start using serverless and we get there, but this is a 4-year plan, right? So we go to no AWS, to taking our first, dipping our toe into the sand, then we go into hybrid, and then maybe we end up cloud native-ish. So that's sort of a real world journey. So it really comes down to, where does your organization in financial services or any regulated industry fall in this area? Are you cloud native? Are you some, in between, or are you never going to go to cloud, or are there some components of your organization that will never go or won't go in the next 5 or 10 years? And those are like your mainframes, right? There are some things that just won't go. They've been around for 30 years and you don't know how to manage them, so they have to stay there. Or one of your partners has one of those. So that brings me to Mike's last financial institution. He probably won't have any issues with his presentation here.
So yeah, the last example was Homer's hedge fund. So if we go back to the first two, so Bart's Banking, they were atypical, huge financial who over many years moved into the cloud, learned a lot of hard lessons, and have kind of come out of it the other side in pretty good shape. With still issues, but in pretty good shape. Lisa's Lending did more of an iterative move towards the cloud, did things pretty structured in a pretty sane way. Now we have Homer's hedge fund. As you'd assume from Homer, not the best way of doing something. So the GIF died. So 3 years in the cloud, but it's not a strategic decision to move to the cloud yet. They're ramping up their apps, but it's not like with Bart's Making, where it was just, let's move everything into the cloud. The tools and the skills are still building. Developers aren't used to what the cloud means for them, much less security understanding what the cloud means. And so the services, the skills, and the tools are all still kind of coming along. And at the same time, they're moving into multi-cloud. So now they have on-prem and then multiple clouds they have to secure, and SaaS, as Ken talked about before. So, oops. Never using the cloud again. Okay.
This is like an embedded lesson, right?
Yeah, this is all intentional. This was planned. All right, so what's happened? They wandered into the cloud and they can't get out. So I think this story is much more typical than a lot of companies, because people start experimenting with AWS. They use some EC2, some RDS, and then developers keep moving more and more workloads there. And before you know it, you are a cloud-based company, and you can't back out of that. And it's not that they necessarily even want to. It's not that they don't want to be in the cloud and they want to stay on-prem forever. It's just that they didn't do it intentionally, and that's unlike Lisa's Lending. So they're kind of where Bart's Making was 5 or 4 years ago. So everything that Bart's Making does have, this is hard to say after a while, Homer's hedge fund doesn't have. So the basics aren't there. So knowing what's in the cloud is not set up yet. Even basic things like vulnerability scanning, that's not there yet. All of these kind of very basic things that we think of, reporting, tooling, they don't even have a multi-cloud strategy, but they're already spinning up multiple clouds. Can anyone tell me what that is right there? Prius, cloud, hybrid cloud. I am a dad, so that's my dad joke for this presentation. So yeah, they have kind of a hybrid cloud strategy where they're not moving everything over. So basically, they're trying to do all these things at once. They don't have a 500-person security team that can tackle all of these things. So what do they do then? You have to start putting together a plan of how you tackle this. Like they can't back out of the cloud. They can't shut down their AWS accounts and just say, no, we're sticking with on-prem. So you have to create a plan for how you will adopt the cloud and how you'll take everything that's already there and formalize it. So a word that gets thrown around a lot is patterns. And I think it's pretty important because not everyone can be the special snowflake that does things their own way. You have to shape things in a way that people can adopt it and then have some kind of norms that everyone's using when you move into the cloud. Not everyone can use whatever they want from AWS or Azure, and then just, we have a security team who's trying to secure 50 different services. So having patterns for how you go to the cloud is really important. So building that out, even using something like Elastic Beanstalk just to start out, just to get things into the cloud in a standardized deployment model can give you a lot more control. Standardizing identity and access management, all those things are fundamental basic ideas, but they have a huge security impact. And then you need a team of people, different stakeholders that are centralized who can bring together all the different pieces of the cloud and really put a plan together and drive towards that. Because if you don't have that and you're just trying to do it piecemeal, you're always going to stay in a horrible, insecure mishmash of on-prem and cloud. So, and then a quick word on multi-cloud. A lot of people have different opinions on what multi-cloud means. Some executives like to think of it as a way to avoid vendor lock-in, which I don't agree with because you can't really use something like KMS or IEM in AWS and then not be locked in because your whole authorization model is built on a proprietary tool. So I don't think of it as that way, and I don't think of it necessarily as a cloud agnostic, like building cloud agnostic workloads that you can deploy to Azure or AWS. I think it is more you have different platforms that have different strengths, and that's a good thing. I mean, there's some things that Azure does, even from a security perspective, that is better than AWS, even though they're not as far along as AWS. So people should really utilize those strengths. But it is difficult for us as security folks, if you're trying to be an AWS security expert, to then also pick up Azure or GCP. So it's a tough thing, but it is happening. It is going to become more popular. And I don't think it's going to be necessarily trying to be agnostic or trying to be a DR plan. It's going to be kind of using the different strengths from the different clouds. So compliance. So as I said, Ken and I both have done a lot of very technical work. We spent years doing pen tests and doing source code reviews and working with developers and general hacking stuff that everyone here probably enjoys. And so compliance to us was always kind of the non-techie people who walk around with clipboards and send out spreadsheets with things in Excel that I don't even understand how they work. I'm sure the data scientists could maybe explain that to me if they don't hate me. But I've kind of changed my mindset over time working more in the cloud, because if as an application security person, you could say to me, like, I can script something out that tells you all the vulnerabilities in your application, and I can script something out to fix all those things, and I can tell you right now how vulnerable your app is, and we can fix it immediately. Like, that would be amazing. But no offense to any vendors in the room, but the tools are not there yet for AppSec, and we're a ways away. But with cloud, we do have that ability. We can say this is how it should look, and then take what it looks like, find the diff, and then fix that almost immediately. And there's a lot of tooling out there that actually, and people doing that already. Bart's Banking was one that did auto remediation. But that's kind of further down the line, and even security people aren't necessarily comfortable with that. They're not always comfortable with saying, we're going to write tools to go and fix things as soon as they are insecure. So My point there is compliance always sounds terrible. I never liked it. I wasn't a fan of compliance people. Maybe I'm still not, but I think it's hugely important, especially in the cloud, to think about security and compliance as one thing and that it's kind of a partnership. And it's really important for security people who know the tech stack to work with compliance, to set the right standards and policies and all those things, because if they create the wrong ones and you're in charge of enforcing them, you're going to hate life and developers are going to hate you. And that's where we've been for 30 years. So what to do? Talked about a lot of different problems, but how can you approach these things and try to fix it? So everything is about scale and complexity when it comes to the cloud. So standardizing on how you do things. Patterns is a big piece. Defining secure ways of doing what developers need to do. If that's how they use EC2 or Lambda, that's what you have to do. You have to create ways for them to do things, to deploy code out, to use services in a secure manner, make that into documentation, and then make that widely available. Don't go in after the fact and tell them that it's wrong. Tell them up front how to do those things, and then turn all of that into pipelines and scripts and CloudFormation templates for people to do that and just adopt. And that goes into automation. Everything in the cloud can be automated. There's no reason for anyone to go into the console and start clicking on things. Everything can be automated, and Ken will talk about that a little bit. And cloud is a people and organization problem, not a tech problem in my mind. The tech is secondary to everything else because cloud cuts across all aspects of the company. And kind of like what I said before, I think it's a huge security opportunity because unlike AppSec, where we have to read code and we have some tooling that can dig into the code, in the cloud we have an API that's very rich and tells us what's there and what's insecure and how we can fix it very quickly. So I think the kind of lessons we learned across all the different companies we have worked with is cloud security is hard at any scale. Even if you have 10 EC2s and you're just a startup and you have one app out there, it's hard to do. So you need to plan early and adapt that plan as often as things change. Every reinvent, you're going to have to adapt your security plan because you now have a new security or a new service you have to start using and make secure. And then just be comfortable with the fact that it's going to be complex no matter what. You can't use the cloud in a simple way and really adapt it. And just be comfortable with those risk trade-offs.
So we've had a lot of years we're trying to pack into this talk. So and I think we can just talk a little bit about what are some of the things that you can do today, or at least prepare for today, and what are some of the things that we can work with. So I do want to go through a pseudo technical example just to show sort of one of the things that we did work with, and that is identity and access management. I think it's one of the first things you hear about you want to do in AWS. So how do we use IAM? I think that if we break it down into that iterative approach that we talked about for leases lending, you have three ways to think about it. Your traditional manual review, you have your compliance auditor, they're coming in, turning that into automation and then making that a managed, tested process for access and management review. So in the traditional, you sort of review a process in place. Somebody comes with you with one of these and they say, all right, Relatnik has server access, DB read, DB write, and the dev manager has read and write. And so they give you that spreadsheet and you say, all right, I'm going to go fill this out. I'm going to tell you whether this is correct or not as your manager, and then, go away. Now for AWS to migrate to that, they give you a lot of tools like the summary manager. For IAM, you can see where a particular policy is used, whether it's in a particular role or group, and you can start to work with those compliance auditors and your teams to have that manual process, but you have to adopt the AWS mindset and start using the AWS best practice. And then once you understand how it all works, you can start to look at automating that. So when we move to the automation phase, we start to think about infrastructure as code, and it's more than a buzzword in this case. The there's a sort of an upfront cost if you're not familiar with something like Terraform or CloudFormation that you have to invest in order for that to even begin to work. So you have to get development teams to buy into this, or your DevOps team, if they haven't already, to buy into whatever you're using. And for Lisa's Lending, as an example, you're using Terraform because you have to manage something hybrid. So you can't use CloudFormation in that particular case because it's not going to support your virtualization platform. So once you get through scripting that out, the management of that becomes essentially a code review. I want to add these two users to this particular resource. That becomes a pull request, and now that pull request is your access review. And that brings us to how that sort of looks inside of that summary manager, so you can still give your auditors that view, that grid view, but on the back end, you're going through that approval process through whatever your change management or something like that. So that's where it becomes managed and testable. So once you are at the point where your development teams are essentially creating pull requests, and those pull requests or changes are going through a change management process, you are satisfying an auditor requirement and you're not faking it, right? You're able to leverage some of the effort that you're used to put into that and making compliance work for you as opposed to the other way around. And once you're at that point where you're doing that all through change management, you can start to remove access from people that have that console access and start to treat everything through Terraform. So what we are trying to get to in Lisa's Lending is we don't want anyone with console access. We have a few users that we're going to have with console access, and everyone else is going to handle things through change management. And we got to a level of that. So you start leveraging things like organizations, and then when people want to experiment, you want a developer account, you can use something like STS roles to treat that user as going into their own sandbox account and having particular access in that way. You start to funnel that access through a ticketing process, and then things become part of your process, and there's a check at every point there. Mike had brought up this tool that I think he had used where to take it to the next level, you can start writing tests for that, and then even doing some linting on the back end so that as you're writing it, your developers know, what's changing. All of this allows you to make some powerful statements, especially in financial services, to auditors and to your teams and to your partners and to your management. You can say things like all access is controlled by our change management process and goes through a code peer review, and that's how we handle access. And you can't really argue with that, and your evidence comes along with it. You can say things like no one or only a few people have console access to AWS, and all those changes are made with Terraform or CloudFormation. It's like hugely powerful to say to an auditor. Sometimes they don't understand what you're saying, but it works out. And then the last thing is changes are validated through standard test automation. If you can test access controls, I mean, that is if you can just generate a report on the fly because you know that your process is good, again, going back to Mike's point of patterns, and that's an amazing place to be in and what you're trying to strive for. And if you are trying to think about it in this way, you don't have to be fully cloud native to take advantage of some of that stuff. And so now we're going to get into some key tooling and guidelines that we sort of worked through in this just to sort of wrap everything up. The first is infrastructure as code. It helps as much as it hurts. I think that getting to the point where you're writing everything as infrastructure as code is like a really big lift because you think you're doing it and there's a lot to learn and it's constantly changing. But when you start using that and you get into that rhythm, your change management stuff, your auditing, all that becomes so much easier, and it does go back into that equation of reducing the overall effort. The second thing is find a champion project to use. Back to that equation, when you're talking about, when we go with the HSM example or the secret management example, it's like you find something to latch onto that's going to benefit your security team and use that as a win for a functional or compliance benefit as well. Security comes first to you, and it should really kind of get to the next level with everyone else. And the last thing is try to predict the future a little bit. Back to the or whatever, pick your time movie. However you want to look at this, you want to think about how will my on-prem solution get me to the cloud. If that's where you want to be, you have to consider things like we were talking about with Vault or the HSM to be a hand in both worlds and to support both worlds. And then once you finally get there, if you want to change over, then you're in good shape. In conclusion, I think some final thoughts.
Yeah. So I mean, I think what Ken and I realized, and we kind of started this talk off with that, is that we've worked in different places and with different companies of varying size and levels of maturity, but they all face some of the same issues, and we can pretty confidently say that you all are all facing the same issues, and a lot of the solutions are the same as we kind of covered already. So hopefully from this you kind of understand where some solutions can be derived to help with those issues.
Yep. And that wraps it up. I think we got through all of it, talked fast. So we can, if there are any questions, we can open it up. Otherwise, thank you so much for having us, and thanks to LASCON for hosting us.
Thanks.